All right, David, Selenia, so good to see you all. We're going to go ahead and give ourselves a minute or two to allow for more folks. There were folks in the waiting room, and they're kind of slowly making their way over to our room today. Guys, thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm going to just do a quick little background on who I am while we're allowing more folks to enter. My name's Christine Marie. I am the founder of the Knowing Group and the host of the Knowing Show and the Craft and Calling podcast. I have the honor of actually moderating a couple of conversations. Last week, I moderated the fireside chat with the fastest growing company CMO last week in DC. And today is just as exciting. We've got two Harvard experts here with us. And I'm going to go ahead. I think we've got a decent number of folks joining us. Patricia, thank you for being here. David, Brittany, y'all, we're going to just start with some housekeeping, and then we're going to dive in. I would love for you all to know that if you jump off, if anything happens with your internet, please feel free to use this link, jump right back in. I actually shot it out to a few of you via email this morning. So if you end up having any internet issues, feel free to use that same link to join us again. The chat room is open for you. We really, really want to be hearing from you throughout this conversation. We have our own agenda. It's curated. It's going to be an excellent, excellent conversation, well worth my time and yours. And we also have created space for an additional 30 minutes after the 60 minutes of Pamela and Paul moving back and forth throughout this conversation, just dedicated to you. We have 30 minutes for you to come with your questions. And so feel free to use the Q&A box. If you look down at the toolbar at the very bottom of your screen, your Zoom screen, it will have a little Q&A box that you can type your questions into. You can type them in with your name associated or actually anonymously. So that's where we get to just be super authentic and honest with what we want to ask. So we'll be monitoring that throughout. We will likely save those towards the end, but sometimes I do pull in those questions just so that they're very real time and relevant as we move forward. So with that, I am so excited for us to be diving into the discussion of how to stay relevant, how to build resiliency without losing ourselves, and in a world that is constantly changing, especially with such various emergence of technology that's really changing the way that we exist in the world. Just this morning, I saw that over 800 employees were laid off by Target at their headquarters in Minnesota this morning. So there is so much changing, so much adapting. And then the question is, how do we adapt well with it? How do we allow for us to be the leaders at the forefront, not just catching up at the rear end of this change that's happening, but how do we lead? How do we actually maintain relevancy as we move forward with this adaptive world? And I cannot think of any two people better to be leading this conversation than Pamela Rucker and Paul Sheesley. Pamela is a Harvard faculty member. She is deeply immersed in many of their programs, and she is a global speaker, speaking frequently in Europe and Canada, as well as throughout the United States, an advisor for many Fortune 100 companies. And y'all, she is, as you will see very soon, she's very it's not even just acclaimed. There's something about her presence and her energy that really is captivating, that there's 25 years backing up everything that she says. There's multiple case studies where she knows her stuff inside and out, and we're really privileged to have her here today. And Paul Sheesley is the founder of Executive Performance Coaching Leadership, and not just working with executive coaches throughout the US and really bringing real change to organizations, but he has the therapeutic perspective, bringing in the clinical counseling and decades worth of experience working with people from the inside out. And so this conversation, as we're talking about how to allow for real change that's powered from within, that really can allow for the external world around us to be positively impacted by our presence and also have us be at the forefront, both are required for us to examine. And these two leaders are going to guide us in this conversation. And Pamela, Paul, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Yes, excited.
Well, let's go ahead and dive in with definitions. We were all in the green room before this talking about how important it is that we're all on the same page as we have this conversation. What do we mean by relevance? What do we mean by identity? And I'd like to start with the latter and hand it over to you, Paul. What do we mean when we say identity?
So identity, in my mind, when I think about leadership in organizations, I come up with really two facets of explanation. So identity and leadership is the internal architecture that's organizing how a person makes meaning of their role, the power that they hold, and their purpose, especially under pressure. And so the way that I look at it is that it's not just who a leader is by their title, but it's actually how they're going to interpret what leadership means to them. And so that's when we start to get into the inner architecture, an evaluation of like, what is that leader's beliefs? What are their schemas? What's their emotional patterns that actually shape how they're going to see themselves in relation to others and that system that they're actually leading. So, in psychological terms, I look at the identity function as really a core lens of like perception as well as regulation. And so that's really governing like what a leader pays attention to. So for them, it might be what feels like a threat or versus what actually might be an opportunity. It dictates how they respond under pressure and stress. So whether or not they default to old behavior such as like over controlling or avoidance versus like curiosity. And I think it defines what leadership success really feels like internally, and that there's an alignment, there's a belonging, and there's a sense of cohesion that's experienced. So that would be from a leadership perspective. And then, as I mentioned, the organizational perspective, I think that a leader's identity is going to set the tone for that collaborative narrative, essentially, not just within themselves, but also for the team. So the design, obviously, is that the team, I think, consciously and unconsciously mirrors the leader's sense of self. And so if that leader's identity is stuck in like an identity of rigidity, then you'll hear things like the inner narrative or messages like I have to know everything, right? And so that unfortunately brings a culture where it becomes more like compliance driven. But if the leader is able to identify and actually live through flexibility, meaning that they're showing up to learn, to adapt, and to empower or understand, then that culture is actually going to become, I think, more resilient and innovative within that structure of the organization. So the further the identity piece, looking at that inner architecture component, we have to be able to strengthen that, identify that, allow that to be malleable before we even get into a strategic alignment. So we have to look at that infrastructure internally. We have to understand what's driving the person's perception and behavior. And so we have to look at those patterns. We have to look at implicit roles and we have to look at biases, et cetera. And so we want to also be able to find blind spots, whether that's unrelenting standards or perfectionism or even fear of loss or external approval from the board, whatever it is, those distortions will ultimately be interpreted and signaled through their inability to lead that strategic alignment with those that are a part of the organization. So to wrap that up, so when we talk about the identity and leadership, we're really talking about again the integration point between the psychology and performance, so performance psychology, right? So that place where the self concept is going to meet that system design and that they're compatible. Because these days leadership just isn't about managing people; it's really about managing the self that then is leading them.
So, wow. Thank you so much, Paul. I honestly have not heard it described so succinctly and so clearly. So thank you so much for that. I have two quick questions before we jump over to the meaning of relevancy and then kind of tying those two together, identity and relevancy moving forward. You mentioned schema at the beginning, and I just wanted to make sure that we kind of defined that. What do you mean when you say schema?
Yeah. So schema is these inner narrations. It's like these set messages that we follow. They're like these scripts. And over time, these scripts can become embedded and carbon copy replicated over time, especially within our, like, we become biased, right? So the schema or like it's like a radar, and that's scanning the environment for actually threat. And so when that threat is detected, that then activates the message. The message then activates feelings, thoughts, and then behaviors. So, for example, if we take the schema of perfectionism, and something is less than perfect, right? Maybe there's a criticism, maybe accolades wasn't given to a degree that was expected. That person's perfectionism schema would then become activated, which then creates internal chaos. Then they're becoming reactive as opposed to proactive. And that behavior then can become transcribed and even taken out on the teams that are in front of them and
Right.
ultimately lose focus of that strategic alignment. And so as we talk more through the webinar, I'll thread that in the strategic
Good.
alignment as well as the inner architecture and what those belief systems might look like, especially when when leaders face threats all the time. The environment is a threatening environment. It's not a perfect environment. And so it's important to understand one's schema and how it relates to a chaotic environment.
So good. Thank you. That was incredibly helpful. Y'all, just a reminder, please drop in any questions you have in the chat. Pamela, I would love to first, hi, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for being such a beautiful participant as Paul was sharing. I would love to hear your definition of relevance and if it is fitting to kind of tie in any elements there with identity. But when you talk about relevance, what does that mean to you?
Well, I want to first piggyback on what Paul was talking about and think about how interesting it is how the identity affects us and how we think. I heard someone say that often when we go through things in life or at work, we're replaying a script from our childhood. And a lot of those things that we have formed in our identity are forming the way that we see things and the way that we feel like we're relevant. And so I think it's a strong tie-in,
Mhm.
particularly when you think about what then comes up on our radar, which I'll be talking about later on. So when I think about what relevance means for organizations, I think about it as the ability of the organization to matter. And when I say matter, I mean to consistently matter in the eyes of all the people that it serves every day. And so what that means is that it's not just about being known. Do people know who you are? Do they know what you sell? But it's, are you actually needed? Are you actually chosen again and again and again for the results and the outcomes that you deliver? So to me, an organization is relevant when its value and its identity and its impact all can stay aligned with the way that the world is changing every day. So it's about how you take what you offer and deliver it in a way that matters and in a way that matters to the customer so that it is still meaningful to them and meaningful in the market and meaningful in the industry, even right now. So when an organization is relevant, then the customers see everything that you do or the products and services that you offer as essential and not optional. They are the obvious choice, the thing that I'm going to go after all the time. Employees might feel that they're proud to say that they work there, or partners and people who are investing in the company see it as a place where growth is still happening. But when you start to see organizations lose relevance, then it starts to look like maybe their offerings are outdated, or maybe they're tone deaf, or maybe their innovation is lagging behind what we see happening in the marketplace or lagging behind what we see that our customers needs. You might find companies who are busy, but they're not necessarily in demand. So they're doing a lot of work, but they're not necessarily growing. And so then if you take that context and apply it to people, relevance for people means that I'm staying valuable, I'm staying visible, I'm staying connected to what's happening in the world, I'm staying connected to what the world currently needs. So for people, it's how you take your skills and tell your story, how you take your strengths and tell your story and connect the dots in ways that show that you can contribute in line with what the organization is expecting right now. And so that's why relevance is not just necessarily about chasing trends or reinventing yourself constantly at your core. It's about translating who you are into what is needed next. And that's why I think it's so closely tied to this idea that of identity that Paul is talking about. So if you are relevant, you can adapt to all of the things that are happening around you without losing any of your authenticity at all, right? You can sense what's changing in your environment. You can actually change your approach before somebody has to ask you to do it. Your presence in the room might add value when you're working on new things or when you're working in new environments that you might find yourself in. But like an organization, if you lose relevance as a person, what you start to do is use yesterday's logic for today's problems. And I heard a leader once say that's the kiss of death, right? To use
Mm.
yesterday's logic on everything that's happening today. Maybe you stop learning or you stop listening, and that creates that rigidity that Paul was talking about. If you are rigid and you aren't learning, you don't have a growth mindset, then your confidence is shrinking, your thinking becomes rigid, you're no longer resilient, right? And so I think that relevance today is harder than ever. It's more urgent than ever before because all of these environments we find ourselves in are changing faster than all of our systems are changing or our habits are changing. And that's a real problem. You have to be far more adaptable today than you had to be in the past. And so you have to navigate all this constant technological disruption. As you just mentioned, AI is changing the way that we all do work. Automation, digital transformation is changing the way that we do work. Look at all of the layoffs that we heard about due to AI just this week, right? I think it was 48,000 in some cases, 12,000 in another.
Hmm.
It's shifting customer expectations. So people want speed, they want personalization, they want purpose. It means that success does not look like what it used to look like before. It's not just revenue anymore, but people are looking at how you can impact them, how you impact society, how you're impacting the world, whether they can trust you, and whether you work in sustainable ways. It's important because customers have shorter attention spans and they have much longer expectations. Customers have way more expectations now than they ever had in the past and have more power than they've had in the past. So it used to be that relevance meant building a better product. And so because of that, I had the better product, I would win. But now it means a better alignment. And Paul and I will talk about that. More alignment between who you are, what you offer, what the world needs, what the organization can deliver, what you can deliver as an individual. And I think that that means that relevance is a discipline. It is not an accident. It is something that you focus on over and over and over again. You're going to practice it, you're going to work on it and build a strength in that.
Hmm.
Now, that's important because relevance is a moving target, right? It's something you have to do over and over and over again. What was relevant today is not necessarily going to be relevant tomorrow. You can't show up today looking like you did yesterday because your customers are evolving and their problems are changing and their priorities are changing and their values are changing faster than you and your processes can. And when you cannot keep up, then you're going to be exposed as a person or an organization that's not relevant. It's a moving target because markets are shifting. Your companies are in technology are redefining what was great and what great looks like. What used to be great and groundbreaking yesterday is commonplace and table stakes today. You know, I started off in the industry 30 years ago. You said 25, but I'll claim 30, and when I started off as a developer, I was in the internet when it was magazineware, and we were bringing data to the web. And I was in a program once recently, and I was explaining what magazineware was and I said it's like a catalog. And one of my participants raised their hand and they said, "What's a catalog?" They had no idea at all what it was. And so a lot of times when we talk about what we did that was great before, it's just expected right now, right? It's expected that we're going to do
Yeah.
that. And so it's relevant because all of your industries are colliding and boundaries are blurring and cars are becoming computers and banks are becoming apps and retailers are becoming media companies. And so we're constantly seeing companies do things and become something today that we never would have seen before. And that means all of those expectations are rising. So what amazed people yesterday is just assumed today. And so
Hmm.
when my expectations keep going up, it's harder for you to please me. It's harder for you to delight me. It's harder for you to win me over. And so all of that means that what makes you relevant today might make you obsolete tomorrow. And so you have to keep looking around and adjusting to your environment and looking at a radar that's going to help you do that successfully. And I'll talk about that in a minute.
So good.
Hmm.
I really, both of what you're saying, I love this conversation because they dovetail so perfectly into each other. Effectively, the inner architecture, Paul, that you're talking about, Pamela, what you're saying with relevance is that that's simply the external manifestation of the inner architecture.
Hmm.
And really, you said this in so many words effectively, just to kind of summarize these two dynamics working together. We project the past onto the future. So if we have yet to reconcile the past, we are going to be unable to truly not just move into the future freely, but
Yeah.
dream and create something new because
Mhm.
our fear is preventing us from being able to see the future clearly. So then it's like, okay, how do we do this? Like, so we're not stuck here. Thank God. Pamela, what did you want to say?
Well, I was going to say, Paul, and I'd love your thoughts on this, but we've
Mhm.
seen so much research about fear making your IQ drop, right? And so I talk
Mhm.
about this a lot. You can spend a lot of time learning,
Oh yeah.
but if in the moment you are afraid because you have not learned to look up and look around and see what's happening around you, even when you know a thing, you might not be able to access it and utilize it to create value. Do you find that to be true?
I do. So, when I think about adaptive challenges, the emotional, the inner architecture can definitely get in the way of that. I was even thinking as you were speaking about relevance being this living system, and I think the challenge is I think it's under evaluated is the process about how do we keep it a living system and not a dying one? And who do we surround ourselves with to be able to have those checks and balances? Who do we talk to about fear? Who do we talk to about these concerns or misalignments within the team? And
Mhm.
so I think that identity evolution, I think it's critical to have that radar, which I know you'll talk more about, and because the technical expertise and we need more than that. I mean, that used to be the foundation for who we look to for leaders is that they had that expertise. But now it really does come down to this identity evolution, the relevance, how it's a living system. And so that constant reevaluating of oneself, I mean, without the radar, then there isn't a strategic alignment. It's just not, it's just going to falter.
So good. And just to make one quick note here with the fear, there's also, Paul, you mentioned this earlier, the dogma of viewing things black and white and being rigid and not being able to then be malleable for the evolution, for the fluidity that is necessary for there to be living systems in
Yeah.
order for us to adapt. So with that, obviously we're kind of here at this moment where it's like, okay, we're just aware of all the problems. What are the solutions and what can we do? And I just want to honor every single one of you
Sure.
once more for attending this conversation. So much of the time that was taken over the years
Yeah.
and allowing for the space and time for us to actually consider, well, what are my values? Who am I? What is the fear that would tether me to the past versus allow me to move into the future freely? So
Hmm.
much of that time and space is filled with distraction and filled
Yeah.
with noise. And
Yeah.
so honoring all of you for joining. And Pamela, I'm so excited to move through your RISE framework today, and that begins with radar, which both of you have already mentioned a couple of times. And I'm so excited for you to dive into that. Before you do, y'all, the chat, it looks like we're having a little bit of trouble there. Go ahead and put in your Q&A. David, I just saw your note in there, so I'll go ahead and take a gander at that in just a minute. So guys, fill out your questions into the Q&A section. Pamela, can you start us off with the very first of your RISE framework, RISE, starting with our radar?
Yeah, I will. And I'll piggyback on what you just said about applauding everyone who joined, because at the core of this idea of a growth mindset we talk about is the idea that you're willing to break up the ground that's hard where you are and deliberately plant something new. And so you're reaching out and trying to get more information, and that's what this is about. So when I talk about my relevance rise lens, I use this to help people navigate a rapidly changing world. And so I have four letters, RISE, and the R is for radar. And the radar is about spotting signals that other people miss, right? This is how it's learning to notice what is hiding in plain sight so that you can see shifts coming before your competitors do. And this is more important now than it ever has been, because a lot of times our strategies are expiring. What used to work yesterday is not working today. And so staying relevant isn't just about defending the position you have. Maybe you're first and you want to keep it. It's about constantly re-earning that position over and over and over and over again. Now, as you go into the next section, we'll talk a little bit about identity and we'll talk about the idea of story and evolution. But I have three things that I tell people to look at when we look at this idea of radar. And the first one is, what should you be looking out for, right? And so there's this great book that I like to recommend called Hiding in Plain Sight. by Eric Joachim Staller. And so that book focuses specifically on how to find your company's next big growth move. And I think it highlights three things that I talk about all the time that should really be on your radar. What's happening with your customer? What's happening with your market? What's happening with your industry? And so let's look at the first one, which is your eye on the customer. This is about going out and looking at what your customers really need, right? Their met needs and their unmet needs, or the problems that they have that they just don't seem to be able to tell you about really well. And so I love uh, the Ford's comment from years ago that if I had asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Sometimes customers have a need, but they just don't know how to tell you what that is. They struggle letting you know what the real problem is. And so if you think about how this is impacted with all the ride sharing we see now, they didn't say that they wanted a ride sharing app. They said, I'm so sick of taxis. They take forever. You don't know how much you have to pay. You don't know if they're coming or not. And so this book says something that I really agree with, that breakthrough opportunities for growth are hidden not in just what customers say that they want, but what frustrates them and the hacks that they're doing for themselves. And so the first thing you want to do is look at your customers' pain points. What kind of problems are you solving for them? What kind of jobs are you doing for them? And those jobs could be functional, as in the actual thing you do, or it could be emotional, as in how they want to feel. And then you want to look at jobs that are close to the things that they're doing as well. And so there's a great example they give about vitamins and water. So if I'm taking a vitamin, I probably need something to drink it with, like water. And so, oh yeah, why not create vitamin water, right? Because it's very close to the thing that people were doing. You also want to look at contradictions, right? So this is about things that might seem like they're opposite, like having really good insurance with really low premiums, or having fashionable clothing with a really low price. So the idea of fast fashion has figured out how to make this work. And so we've seen companies at fast fashion companies soaring because of this idea that I might wear something once or twice and throw it away. Now, years ago, we would have said, oh my goodness, who would have done that? Who would ever buy something and throw it away after I've worn it a couple of times? But apparently, a lot of people will, because
Mhm.
that's turned into $1 billion business, right?
Mm.
I teach this next one in my program all the time, and that's the idea of non-customers. So, who absolutely refuses to buy from you, and why is that the case? What is it that you're offering, or the way that you're offering, where they say, I'm not going to buy it from you at all? And so we've seen companies actually go after people who say, I'm not going to pay a lot of money for a razor. Sell me the one for $1, right? And this is not in that case that the customer can't pay you. It's that they won't pay you that much. Why won't they pay you that? So what could you offer them? You might also want to look at extreme opposites, right? People who have completely different needs, but both might use your product in very different ways. How can I look out there and see that there's a young family that wants a quad cab truck, but there's a farmer that wants a quad cab truck as well? Why would I want both of them to be looking at my product? And then finally, you want to look at any barriers that you might be able to break for any customers that are locked out of the market. And so Clayton Christensen talked about this many years ago, and I talk about it all the time. It's still true today. You can break a lot of different barriers, but the four biggest ones are money. That's the first one. It just costs too much. Access, it means I cannot get to it. Skills, it's way too hard for me to use. Or time, it just takes way too long. And if you can break one of those barriers, you can actually get customers to chase you by breaking them down and allowing them to get to you. And so we saw Southwest break this barrier of money for people that couldn't afford to fly. They were catching buses, and they were able to do that. Or we've seen many of organizations breaking the barrier of access so a lot of people can quickly join conferences for video like we are right now. We do it so much seamlessly now, but a few years ago, that was very difficult to do. We've
Mhm.
seen a lot of online companies like Canva breaking the barrier of skills, so anybody can professionally create graphics that are out there. Or we're seeing a lot of food delivery companies breaking barriers of time so people can get food from their favorite restaurants and they don't have to actually go out and leave their home to go and do that. So all of those things are things you would look at when you keep your eye on the customer. So you
Mhm.
want to ask yourself, well, okay, who else could do that job? Or what else are they doing when they do that job? And then who refuses to buy from us? And what seemingly opposite things might people do when they're working together that I might bring together as you're looking at your customer? That's the customer. So the second thing you want to look at is your eye on the market. And so when you get to this point, you're now looking at larger things like cultural shifts or adjacent industries or big market movements. And you're going to ask yourself questions like, what else is available for my customer to choose? What
Right.
other options do they have? What else would they do if I didn't exist? What would I do if they didn't do the same thing with my company? Would I do that or would they do a different thing altogether? And so, are there substitutes out there for me?
Hmm.
You're going to ask yourself, how can I compete in this space by changing the value narrative so much that I'm so special that people don't even want the substitute, right? And so that means you constantly have to see what your customer wants. You might go look at compliments, like what else goes well with what I'm offering. So steak and wine, they say in the book, goes well together. What else might work well for me? Or Netflix and smart TVs, or things that you might be able to put together with your product to make yourself stay relevant.
Hmm.
After that, look at enablers. What makes your product work? So think of the fact that a car needs tires to work. The engine might be in perfect condition, the air conditioning might be in perfect condition, but if you don't have tires, you can't go anywhere. So the car might turn on and function, but you can't get to where it is you want to go. And so we saw the rideshare apps do this when they combined their ability to connect drivers with the ability to connect a map so that people
Hmm.
can figure out how they can get from one place to another. And then lastly, look at enhancers. What's going to make your product better? And so they make this great point about many of us like coffee, but we like it better if we have flavored syrup in it. And so it's enhancing the product that you're actually selling. And so, or think about how much you love your online audio because you can create a playlist, or you might love working with a voice system because it's integrated with your home devices. So what's enhancing the things that you might work on? And so I
Hmm.
always ask people, if you want to practice this and bring in a bit of AI, go back and ask yourself, well, how could I pick out one substitute for the business that we have, or one complement for the business we have, one enabler and one enhancer? And then how could AI help you figure out, well, what those substitutes might be? Or how could AI help you figure out how you
Yeah.
could optimize yourself with complements, or optimize your enablers, or
Yeah.
figure out how you might be able to have future enhancers? Okay, so I looked at the and tell me if I need to stop here, Christine, because I'll keep on going. So I've looked at the
I
eye of the market, I've looked at the eye of the customer and the eye of the market, and the last one's eye of the industry. So do I need to pause?
let's keep going. I just wanted to make a quick comment on those elements. Y'all, it's customer lifetime value is such a good metric to
Hmm.
be like really truly measuring, is this working? Are people staying after they make the
Hmm.
first purchase? Are they, to your point about
Hmm.
enhancers? That's where we see the value, and that's a core metric that can help us with tracking it moving forward. So back to you, Pamela, with the industry piece.
You got me. Before I move on, I've got to piggyback on something you just said about this customer lifetime value. A lot of organizations are doing what we call these customer satisfaction surveys. Am I really giving my customer what they want? But there's new research out that says you should actually look at emotional connection and not just satisfaction. Are your customers actually connected to you? Because that's what creates this stickiness. Because you could have really high satisfaction scores and
Hmm.
really low connection scores, and it makes it easy for customers to leave you. And so I don't know if we'll get back around that, but I wanted to be sure that I said that there, because we look at customer lifetime value a lot, but you could
Mm,
get all your metrics could say you're doing well, but you're still not connected to the
Yeah.
customer at all. Okay, so let me do this last one, which is about the eye of the industry. And so this is about knowing what's happening in the industry itself. So, what are all the latest innovations that are happening in the industry? And where are there new partnerships out there? What's disrupting things in your industry? Or who has started to change the rules of the game? And if nobody's breaking the rules at all, can you be the organization that breaks them? And so, this means you have to focus on all of those industry assumptions that you have, and so you want to ask yourself, well, how do the assumptions that I have compare with the reality of the way that people are actually living today? And I say this because when I came into the game 30 years ago, for years, banks felt like customers needed physical branches. But we found out they do not. Online banks have proved that that just isn't true at all. Many times, there are a lot of transactions that happen today without people going into a physical location at all. We thought people wanted to touch and feel things before they bought them, and Amazon has proved that's not true. We thought people had to visit the doctor in person. Teladoc has proved that's not true. So ask yourself, well, what is it that I believe that might not be true any longer? Or ask yourself, how can we shift from what we want to sell to what the customer wants to buy? And so if you think about Starbucks, they might sell coffee, but what they do is win because the customer has a third place to be. I
Hmm.
don't have to be at work. I
Yes.
don't have to be at home. I could go to this place and sit with my friends and have a great cup of coffee. Or ask yourself how you can reimagine the industry that you make possible today that might not have been possible yesterday. What does technology allow me to do, or what does the environment I find myself in allow me to do that I couldn't do yesterday? So it used to be that if you had a small business, you could only sell on Main Street in your local organization, but now Etsy's made it so you can sell all across
Hmm.
the globe, right?
Yeah.
Or you used to need cable in order to see your local TV, but now Netflix and Hulu and Prime and YouTube TV make it possible for you not to need cable at all. So you want to ask yourself, how is the world changing? And what do people need next? A great example of that is that we've seen this trend toward higher quality food over the past few years, and that's given us the rise of large whole food stores or large organic stores. We've seen a lot more people want plant-based options, so now we see the rise of the Impossible Burger and other products that we see in the market. Or you want to ask yourself, given all of those things, how do I need to change my business model?
Yeah.
Do I have the same customer value proposition in that case? A customer value proposition is target customer, the job you do for them, and what you're offering them. Do I have that same customer value proposition, or do I need to change that in some way? What would happen if my competitors change that? And so all of those things come together to create this radar that tells you what you should be looking at. And we spend our
Hmm.
time talking about that one because if you cannot get the radar right,
Mm.
and scan through all these lenses of customer and market and industry,
Yep.
you might actually find yourself overemphasizing one, like maybe the customer, and you forget the market, you forget the industry, and then you
Hmm.
find out that you've been disrupted. Or you might find yourself trying to change your identity for a problem that your customer doesn't have.
Mm, that's
Yeah.
so good. And I've got some good questions here in the chat. Y'all, I think I want to save that for the Q&A section. So please keep asking. Danilo and David, thank you so much for your questions. I see them and I see you. And we'll circle back to those in about, gosh, we've only got 23 minutes left of this section. So let's keep going through the framework because these questions are really valuable, invaluable.
Yeah.
And I actually want to Paul, with you and Pamela, thank you so much. We're going to circle back to radar for the first part of our Q&A, and then the questions will be guided through these framework.
Yeah.
So, Paul, Pamela touched on emotional connection, and I'm so grateful she did
Hmm.
because really, actually, Harvard did a study and found that 95% of customers are making purchase decisions in the subconscious, which is where their emotions live. So, given all of that,
Yeah.
and especially with what you were talking about at the beginning with identity, so many of us are just moving quickly and we actually are
Hmm.
not taking the time to focus on, well, who are we even in alignment with who we are
Yeah.
to thus be able to form that emotional connection that will allow for business to keep going. And actually, David, I know I just said your question was going to wait, but I'm going to go ahead and just pull in pieces of this. David just brought up such a good point. He's the VP of the Armstrong Company, and he's touching on this. So, David, I'm going to take the integrity of what you asked and piecemeal it for later and now. Effectively, we've got such broad age gaps that we're working with. This this younger generation, it is just so vastly different than the older generation, and the buying patterns are just
Hmm.
so very different. And
Yeah.
all of that is a result of their inner architecture. So, how can we, as brands, how do we evolve our identity to allow for emotional connection when the buyers are so different from each other? It's kind of like, Pamela, what you were saying, like, look at the opposite ends of the spectrum. They both need our product, and yet they're so different in terms of their architecture and archetype.
Yeah.
So, how can a brand allow for relevancy with authenticity predicated in who they are?
Yeah. So I have a couple thoughts about the emotional piece, which I could talk forever about. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. Although challenging because now I have to condense all my thoughts. So the emotional piece, I find that emotion actually um, predicts like loyalty better than satisfaction when you have that emotional component that's connected to whatever the consumer is a part of. And when I think about the radar piece, that you talk about, so much of this information is hiding in plain sight. It's just how are they going to be able to capture what the customer experience is? And in order to do that, obviously, you have to have a working system. And so there also has to be a growth system, right? The relevance component. And so when we think about markets, they're always shifting. Technology is always evolving, right? And the expectations, as you mentioned earlier, are just only, they're becoming just commonplace and they're moving faster. And so, in order to stay relevant, again, we got to be able to update that strategy. And I think part of that in the metrics of an organization is actually identifying how do emotions play a significant role in that. Because, when I think about my own emotions when purchasing something, right? So, whether it's buying an Apple product or I bought a pair of Nike shoes or, I bought a Starbucks, I know that they're constantly evaluating me and they're trying to build an emotional meaning, right? Because they're measuring my purchases and and my engagement with them through how many times I log into their website or, how many times I click on this particular item. And so, they're counting on my dopamine, right? They're counting on these reinforcing decisions that then they can replicate to other people. And they just like in an organization, a leader is going to emphasize within their team, a sense of belonging, identity, and maybe even freedom of separation in thought, not just satisfaction, like you mentioned. And I think it's the same concept when we look at people and the general patterns of people, is that's what they're looking for. When a Tesla owner jumps into the new car, right? They're not just going to say, "Oh, I feel satisfied and here I go." They're going to say, "This makes me feel like innovative and maybe even smarter," or, I'm on top, right? And then 6 years later, you buy another car. So, I definitely think the emotional connection is really important to capture, especially in working teams, because we look at for place of purpose, right? And so how do we get people to feel purposeful? So they feel connected, right? They feel that they have a relationship. And so it's that ever evolving atmosphere. So I think you got to have these tough mental models, you got to have these emotional frameworks, and you have to have a system and a radar to be able to capture it with not just your vision, but I think incorporating the vision of the team.
And if I can just jump in there, Christine, and to
Please.
go back to answer the question and piggyback on what Paul just said, if you're going to look to find ways to measure this or to ask yourself, how do I sell in a multi-generational customer base? Similar to how do I deal with employees in a multi-generational workplace? You have to understand the job that you're doing for that individual person. So I find so many organizations, and I'm sure you do too, Paul and Christine, who are trying to sell their one product one way to 100% of the market. And you cannot do that. You actually have to map your market out to find out who each customer is and what their job to be done is. And then to Paul's point, go back and look at connection. Let's take a Starbucks example. You might be able to measure connection with Paul because he logs into the app multiple times. You might be able to measure connection with another person because every time they travel, they go to a Starbucks and you can see where they're logging in and where they're buying from. You might be able to measure connection for a third one because they spend 2 hours in the environment in the actual place on your Wi-Fi conducting business. Connection means different things to different people. And so you want to ask yourself, well, what is that job to be done that you're doing for them? And why is it that you're doing it that way so that you can try to be effective? That's the first one. The second one is if you look at the job to be done and the customer value proposition, target customer, job to be done, what you offer, that implies I have a different set of customers. I might have one that is this age, one is another age, one is a third age, and each one might have a different job to be done.
Mhm.
Job to be done, jobs can be functional or emotional. So if I look at a customer that's buying a luxury watch, for instance, the functional job is I need to tell time. Time doesn't care how it's told. I just need to know what time it is wherever I am, right? But if I'm buying that watch and I'm an older person, that might be the emotional job, might be a symbol of my success. I've worked hard in my career. I've finally
Right.
been allowed to buy myself this job. If a younger person is buying it, it might be status. I want my peers to approve of me. I want people to look at me as though I'm current or I'm hip. It may have nothing to do with what they've accomplished at all. And so organizations fail when they do not look at 100% of the market to ask themselves, is my value being provided?
Yeah.
Because value for one group is not value for another.
Yeah.
And so you have to actually have a multifaceted approach to that discipline to understand how you're creating value.
Mm,
I
so
love
good.
that.
I'm so grateful you said that. Yeah, go ahead, Paul. Yeah.
So it actually correlates with the concept that I use is perceptual agility, right? So
Mm,
being able to have that ability to sense subtle changes, whether it's customer behavior, social sentiment, as you beautifully defined there, or even just technological disruptions, and being able to interpret them before it hits a crisis, right? Whether we run out of money or access or skill or time, we need to be able to get ahead of get ahead of it. And then it also, I always tie back the inner architecture is that identity flexibility, right? So the willingness to be able to re-examine, because I might be a watchmaker and I may have a specific, internally, my goal, my value, my purpose is to make a specific watch for a specific customer. But if my identity isn't flexible, then I'm going to miss all of the rest of the market there and not, and I also then need the willingness to re-examine that, the who we are and how we're going to create and what environment, what are we going to do when the environment changes rather than defending what used to work and then doubling down, if you will. So, then it just keeps going back to that adaptive challenge of identity evolution, right? And that it's not just technical expertise. So I thank you for that. That was great. I love piggybacking on that.
Well, if I can pick
yeah.
up from there, Christine, go back to that identity. That identity part ties everything we've been talking about together, right? So it takes that external awareness of the customer and the market and the industry.
Hmm.
It focuses on internal clarity about who I am and why I matter. And as an organization, how I can create what
Yeah.
matters for the people that I'm paying attention to. And so, given everything that I said, it's obviously important that we know what the value is that we can provide. So, the next logical question is, well, who are we in the middle of all that? Right? We need a
Yes.
clear sense of our identity so that we can
Yeah.
inspire our customers, our employees, we can make better choices. But I have found out through research and practical advice, and Paul, I'm sure you have as well, Christine, you have as well, that many, many, many organizations have problems answering really basic, but what I would think are fundamental questions about their organizational identity that will have a drastic impact on their strategy. And so
Hmm.
Paul Lean works for PwC, and he wrote this in his Harvard Business Review article. I always recommend it to people. He says people should ask questions like, who are we as a company? What is our organizational DNA, right? And it's not just your mission statement or your tagline, but the core belief about who you are that drives all of your behavior, that drives all of your decision making. What is that? And people struggle with that all the time. People will
Right.
constantly tell me that Starbucks is a coffee company and Domino's is a pizza company. But those are the things that they sell. It's not the core of who they are, right? Domino's might not just see themselves as a food company. When you talk to their execs, they say that they're a tech company that just happens to sell pizzas. And understanding that difference is incredibly important. The second one is what makes us unique. So, what are
Mhm.
my distinct capabilities, not just in what I sell, but how
Hmm.
you deliver it in a way that other people cannot easily copy? You might want to ask yourself questions like, what are my advantages? Right. So if I have strategic capabilities that other organizations don't, what are the skills and the systems and the assets and all of those things that I bring together in unique ways with my core offering that give me an edge over everyone else?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
might want to ask yourself, how do we create value? Right? How do I turn my capabilities into something that my customers are willing to pay me for? And this is a big one in the industry right now about how do we push up willingness to pay? We know you can do that primarily through emotional connection and not functional connection because when I compete on a functional level,
Hmm.
well, you're forced to compete on price. So if
Hmm.
all I wanted to do was say I need to tell time, there are a lot of ways to do that. So I'm going to look for the least expensive way to tell time. It's the emotional connection that makes me pay five, six, $7,000 for a watch, right? It's not the functional one that makes you do that. And then you might ask yourself questions like, okay, how are we different? How are we positioned in the market? How do I stand out in the minds of all the people that I'm working with or creating solutions for every day? And then what do we do really, really well as we do that? If we look at our core capabilities, what are we really great at? Not what we wish we were great at, but what are we actually really, really great at doing as we work every day? And then finally, who is in our ecosystem that helps us deliver on our promise so that the things that we say that we can get done, we can actually get done? And what is it that's precious to us that we cannot possibly lose? That no matter what happens, even if we do need to pivot a bit in the way that we show up in the world, we always have to be this. That's our core of ourselves, right?
Yep.
And I have found that You can do this for organizations. And Paul, I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well, but you can do it for individuals too. You can
Yeah.
ask those same questions of yourself as an
Yep.
individual. And that then creates this idea of organizational and aspirational alignment, that what I want as a person is aligned with what the organization wants to do.
Yeah.
So that when you create vision, I see myself in the future of that vision. And that's what makes me autonomously motivated to succeed, that I actually see myself in the future that you create and I want to be there.
hmm No,
Mm.
you use the word discipline, and I'm going to use that because it's very important in the terms of like it's discipline of that constant calibration between the inner architecture that drives the meaning and the motivation and that strategic alignment that actually directs the execution. The thing that I also find that organizations and leadership teams struggle with is the concept of self-disruption. So when
Mm.
I think about self-disruption, I think of something. See, that my emotional attachment to Netflix, right? So they are constantly redeveloping themselves through self-disruption. That's how they've been able to thrive over these years, is they're constantly outgrowing their own success.
Yeah.
People get comfortable. That also is an evaluative component with leaders and organizations is how do we know we're comfortable? What are we, and if we are comfortable, then we need to self-disrupt and figure out what are we missing? Where are our blind spots? We need to be able to feel, leaders need to be able to tolerate uncertainty, first of all. And then they need to be able to confront that uncertainty and then their own inner narrative. And then we can move to that strategic alignment piece where the system is actually going to reward the experiments that the company is taking and that the learning curve is occurring. And so, when I think about even AI and how, there's such a resistance to it, it's the companies who are looking at that disruption as a welcome mat and saying, bring it on. Let's take a look at it, whether it's JP Morgan and Chase, or it's Netflix, or it's Morgan Stanley and their wealth management algorithms, or if it's Pixar. I mean, these are the companies that you constantly see because they're constantly self-disrupting.
Mhm.
And so I think the leaders who are able to cultivate that, they're not just responding and reacting, they're actually going to absorb it and then they're going to integrate it and they're learning. And so I think that's where clarity and identity really define the direction. And so I think that the resilience there is to recognize that, it's not just toughness and grit, but it's really just coherence, right? Inner coherence, external coherence. And again, getting back to the who we are and what we do and who we do it for, I
Mhm.
think that's the new currency of relevance.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah, I couldn't agree more. And Christine, if I may, the idea that AI is coming in and being so disruptive reminds me of the VUCA term we used to all talk about years ago about volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. AI is causing all of that right now. And so it's really important that we understand our identity and how we use that in the marketplace because identity then becomes the anchor for the relevance, right? You cannot
Mm.
decide where to play or how to win unless you know who you are. And if I can figure out who I am, and how I add value. And to your point, Paul, disrupt myself continually, find new ways to create value continually. Well, it's a lot easier to tell my story or to evolve, right? To
Mhm.
actually talk about how I can bring new
Yeah.
value today, to connect the dots about where I've come from and where I'm going and who I'm evolving into. That's a lot easier to do if I can
Right.
do those first two up front.
I'm so grateful you brought it. I know story is that next piece. Y'all, we kind of evolved into moving from radar to I identity, the second in Pamela's framework. And then the S is story. I am mindful of the time so that we can move into Q&A. What I'd like to do, there's a number of things that you guys were just talking about that frankly were very actionable for us to take back to our businesses. Pamela, you offered a litany of questions that I think is so important for us to take back to our companies and to our leadership teams and ask those, do we actually know who we are as a corporate identity across the board of analysis with these questions in mind? And y'all, you will be getting this replay back, so you can jump back to it. It's, roughly towards the end of the first 60 minutes where Pamela went through her list. And Paul, before we move into story, I would love if you can give one or two just practical practices that we can take on an internal level of getting ourselves to be able to kind of practice uncertainty and sit in that, because that's going to show up in the boardroom as we're having these questions. So it's kind of like we need to do the internal identity piece first, go in and have this conversation around corporate identity. So would you give us maybe one or two practices for us as leaders to help us with our own internal identity? And then Pamela's questions can kind of help us on the corporate side.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I think about identity and resilience, I'm going to put them together because they bring about a lot of emotion. They're very emotionally charged, and so the identity, identification, the resilience, adaption. It's not the absence of stress. So that's not going to happen, right? We're not looking at a perfect environment to function in. It's really the presence of self that's going to be able to stay online.
Mm,
And I can dive into this even more as far as like the neurobiological impacts, the limbic system going offline, the prefrontal cortex and decision making, and how do we get that back online so the leader can get back to making good choices, if you will, right?
right.
And not just for themselves, but the psychological stability and safety in the environments that's around them. So the people who are actually, up and close. And so, when I think about the inner architecture piece, I think there's a lot of exploratory questions, and I think just self-awareness. And going back to the radar, your radar isn't going to work if you're not self-aware. And so that internal system, reevaluating your identity, your beliefs, your values, your emotional, how are you feeling? I think these micro check-ins are really important. So that's one kind of skill task that I'll have people do is where, they're checking in on themselves. And so that then becomes just part of their operating system. Because if you wait to check in on yourself when something happens, it's actually too late at that point, right? So, I mean, because then you have no working system for regulation. You have no new inner narratives to combat the old narrative. And so I love working with folks and being able to identify the messages and helping them to go, okay, well, where is this message rooted? When does it come apart, become activated? And what would you want to do with it? What do you want it to feel like? Knowing that we can't get rid of some of these messages, it's just how do we minimize the impact? So that's just one thing under the inner architecture that I like to magnify when working with emerging leaders, even succession planning and folks who are coming on board to a whole new environment, and they're bringing with them the baggage. And baggage isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's not a good thing when it becomes activated and then it's not addressed. So the self-awareness piece is really, really important in the inner architecture, especially in the beginning.
Mm, so good. I thank you for that. That was a really, really helpful practice. Y'all, that's if you can just go run to the restroom and just journal for 30 seconds, 60 seconds, and just allow for that initial process of like, how do I clearly am activated. Why, and asking yourself why a couple of times can help you get to that root moment. I mean, Pamela, you said this earlier that so much of those schemas, those messages, Paul, that you said is rooted in childhood. And so really, by way of us asking, how do I feel in this moment, allows for us to de-escalate and ensure that we're not bringing that 6-year-old, 8-year-old little boy into the boardroom.
Yeah,
And
because we're
so
not
Paul was practice.
right. Because if we're in a bullying state, like if we're overcompensating, then we are actually going to diminish someone else's ability to express ideas potentially, or even to make questions or even mistakes on their own. And so, this even psychological safety when we get, I could get into that as well, is a number one predictor of like these high performing teams. And so it's so fascinating that you don't need to be a neuroscientist, but I think you need to be a neurobiological leader. I think you really have to understand people the process of people, you understand the customer, the process of customers, people, and yourself. And so it all just threads together. It's being able to understand what part you play and how and what parts you don't want to play out in your ability to lead and to manage and to grow.
So good. And I know that there's a whole, I mean, that's a whole other
That's a whole nother.
conversation. The neurobiological leader word. I wanna wrap up with your two, Pamela. If you can just kind of bop those out, S and E, and then we'll jump into the Q&A. That would be great.
Absolutely. And I'm going to tie that to what Paul talked about bringing your systems back online, right? So if you are offline, whether it's through not staying relevant, through overwork, through misunderstanding the environment, whatever it may be that takes you offline, it's very difficult for you to come back and tell a story because the essence of a story is you connecting the dots about who you are, where you've come from, and what you can deliver. And so you want to create these strong and believable and compelling stories that explain all of that so that you can actually talk about all of your capabilities. And this is important because believing in yourself and having those capabilities is not enough, or having a background and experience isn't enough. You really have to be able to tell a good story about that. This is important for leaders, especially because organizations have marketing groups that go and talk about their story, and they put out ad campaigns that talk about their story. And we don't have all of that. So we have to be able to connect the dots about where we've come from, where we're going, and why it relates to what the company is trying to do right now so that we can make ourselves matter. That's the S. And then the E is about evolution. And this is about how you take the relevance that you have in the moment and you use it to evolve in a way that says, I'm not going to be going from a stable old to a stable new, but I'm going to a transient yet next. What is the next thing that I have to be? And so the analogy I like to use is that a lot of times we think about a caterpillar going to a butterfly. That was a stable old to a stable new. We're not in that world anymore. It's like Dorothy when she said, we're not in Kansas anymore. That's not where we are. You are
Mm,
going to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. So you need what an adaptable identity, right?
mm,
That part of you that says the core is the same, but I'm extending myself out to be something else, almost like the root of the tree is the core, the
mm,
branch is who I need to become for the moment. And so I'm trying to ask myself, how do I need to reach out and become this thing in this moment so that I can be successful? And that's really important because a lot of people struggle with that. They don't know what to go to next. And so
mm.
what they try to do is make the caterpillar be the frog or the caterpillar be the next thing.
Yeah.
And they really need to be comfortable with saying, if I don't burn the entire essence of who I am and all I'm doing is reconfiguring how I show up, that gives me the ability to say, I can let go of things that don't serve me anymore and then transition into things that do because I'm looking around at what is necessary in the marketplace for me to be successful. And
Yeah.
organizations need to do this just like people do. Rita McGrath wrote a great article on transient advantage that talks about that, where you can actually put your organization together in a way where I expect to change. I do not expect to stay the same because there is no sustainable competitive advantage anymore. I
Mm,
recognize I have to change. And so
mhm.
because of that, I'm building myself with this mindset that I'm going to morph into my next. And I have to decide what next looks like, communicate that to the rest of the group, and then they use their adaptable identities to then morph into that with me because
Mhm.
that's where they want to go with their next too.
Mhm.
Hot dog. All right, y'all. Q&A time. This has been such an incredible conversation. The way that we know it's an incredible conversation is that no one has dropped from this conversation. Everyone has stayed here, stayed engaged. We have a number of questions. I'm gonna take up a moment before we dive into everyone's questions here in the QA box. Paul, to that point of involvement, I have two questions for you. It is so important. We're talking about psychological safety. We're talking about how to remain online once our nervous system activates and we move into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode. Immediately we get flooded and we can't think and we can't live in alignment with who we want to be and who we're striving to be. And so as we're seeking to evolve, to Pamela's point, how do we communicate this well to those in our lives, whether it's our immediate circle or our leadership circle, so that we can help them as we're learning new patterns and new ways of being through this process of identity evolution
Yeah.
and relevance evolution.
Yeah.
How do we preserve their psychological safety when we start actually responding differently than their programmed I guess you could say, put their own
Yeah.
program understanding.
Yeah. When I think about, we talk about the limbic system, under threat, the fight, flight, or freeze. I think most people know that, right? So when that's activated, it narrows perception and amplifies reactivity. And so it's not uncommon that I'll hear, managerial levels refer to upper management or VPs or executives by identifying their limbic responses. So, it's like if the leader's nervous system becomes the emotional thermostat, if you will, for the organization, people are going to notice, and then that's how you become defined. And then people respond to that protectively, unfortunately. And so that doesn't foster that psychological safety that was mentioned earlier. The adaptive leader is actually going to practice this kind of regulatory, like, how did I put it before? It's like this transparency, right? So regulatory transparency, where they're not transmitting all of that's going on inside, but what they're doing is they're inviting dialogue, right? And so they're modeling this like effective attunement within their teams and their leadership and their direct report. And so, what they're doing is they're helping others to adjust to the pace and helping others help with their tone and helping others structure accordingly. So I think being able to model as a leader and being able to read, we'll call it the emotional data that's surrounding oneself because it's actually there, it exists. And if you're a leader and you've heard people, oh, watch out, or oh, did you hear what happened? It's like people aren't necessarily responding to the content of what happened. They're responding to the thermostat of the leader who's walking out of the meeting, and everybody's like bracing, right? So that's not going to create a psychological safety. And so, yeah, I think that answered the question.
Yeah, I love it. And I'm curious, as we're going through this process of change, would it be, is it helpful to even, I know, Paul, for example, like you go into organizations and you work with their leaders individually. And Pamela, you do the same thing, coming in and talking to the organization. So I'm curious, is it actually helpful to get the buy-in from the kind of the almost the root organization being the ones to bring in these individuals to help the leaders evolve? Pamela, what are your thoughts on that?
It's so interesting that you said that. I was thinking of a time I had gone into a company, and I believe that it's the leader's responsibility to enable every voice. And so I'm going to preface what I'm going to say with this story, with this idea. If I walk into a room and let's say I have been watching the radar, let's say I've been looking at my identity, looking at the way we need to change, and I come into the meeting and I'm gung-ho with an idea. The only way I can communicate that idea is that somehow I interrupt the balance of power. Someone in that room has power, and unless I feel like I have the power and authority to talk, I have to take it from someone else, or they have to give
Mm,
it to me. And so, as a leader, it's important that we enable every voice. And so, if I hear a person that's quiet and not talking, it's important that I ask you, what are you thinking? I see that you've been nodding a lot, Christine. What's on your mind? And I give you the floor and I'm giving you the power to speak because
right.
often I found people that say, I'm not going to talk. And that leads me to the way I'm going to answer your question. I was in an organization once and we were working on topics similar to this. And, when I go into places, I don't know who's who. I don't know the politics. I don't know anything. I just do my programs. And so I just called out this one person who seemed to be intently listening to me. And I said, tell me what's going on your mind. What do you think about this?
Mm,
And he said, I always knew this wasn't going to work. And I said, really? Why didn't you say anything? He said, nobody really cares what I think. And I said, why would you think that? Why would you think
Hmm.
that no one
wow.
cares what you think? And he said, well, I've learned a long time ago to just give the old company nod. And so, of
Mm,
course, that piqued my interest. What is the old company nod? He said, well, that's when you know that the train has left the station and they just want you to say, yeah, that's a good idea. And then I say, sure, sure, good idea. And I walk out of the room and I tell everybody else that's going to fail in 6 months. And so he says, I know that they don't care what I think. And so I talked to the executives once the program was over, and they said, do you know he leads one of the largest departments that's working on some of the most strategic initiatives we have, he never speaks up at all like that. He never talks at all. How did you get him to speak? And part of it was
Wow.
I just didn't know who he was, right? And so the point was his company nod was what had gotten them stuck in the goo, that rigidity that Paul talked about,
Hmm.
where people did not hear that they had a voice. They did not believe it.
Mhm.
And so, because of that, it's important sometimes to work with the team, but also to work with the leader. Because I've actually been in spaces where we were talking about challenges an organization had, and the C-level person stood up and said, I just can't wait to hear what someone has to say about that because I know we really have an open door policy around here. And instantly, all of the psychological safety goes down to Paul's term that they gauged the temperature and they knew it was not safe to speak. It was
Yep.
too
Yep.
hot in the room and no one
Mm,
was going to speak. So
mm,
sometimes you need to call a leader in to have a conversation with them to say, here's the way I think we might be able to operate going forward. And this is especially important for that caller that said they have a multi-generational workforce. Because the way some of us worked out of the late boomer or other environments, there are things we took and things that we did that the people coming up in the workspace now, coming into power now, are not going to tolerate. They're not going to take. And
Hmm.
so you have to create an inclusive environment, and that is going to be table stakes for them. And so I think sometimes you need to do both. If I can't call a leader in, then what I try to do is model the way. When I'm in the moment, when I'm teaching the organization, I model for them a sense of authenticity. I model times that I have failed and I was
Hmm.
afraid to go to work the next day. I create stories and spaces where people feel safe to talk about that. You know, we all talk about creating a failure tolerant organization, but nobody really wants people to fail. So nobody wants to
yeah.
do it. So you have to
Good.
model the way in the moment so that
Hmm.
people actually use those tools that you're given and recognize that they don't have to feel like they're putting themselves on the line and feel strange. You create the
Mm.
opportunity for them.
Hmm.
I appreciate this because David asked two different questions that kind of have relevance between each other. Effectively, it's, he mentions it's been hard to get people to think outside of the box without proof of like this is going to work. And then also not just with younger and older generations in terms of our customers, but also within our teams.
Hmm.
They're going to be getting buy-in in very different ways. And so kind of based on what you just said, Pamela, I'm thinking that one very specific way to do that is intentionally facilitating the space for people to come in. And I would even say in that space, as the leader, don't go first. Go last. Because once we say it's the train at the station's already left, it's like once we say people are much more reticent to volunteer. So I think one, create the space. Two, to your
Hmm.
point of, you know, withhold your information and your ideas to allow for
Yeah.
creativity. What else in that, Paul? How would you add maybe one or two other ideas there of how
Yeah.
to really let people foster this energy in the space of let's dream and be creative
Yeah.
after we've done the work to put aside emotional uncertainty because that can block us from being able to future dream.
Yeah, because I'll add on to, Pamela, you talking about bringing the leader in and having that one-on-one conversation. I think that has to occur quite frequently, especially when we're looking at the generational gap within an organization's leadership
Mhm.
team. Because I think when we can get to the top, it trickles down, right? And so when leaders are able to anchor, I think, identity and they're able to like really transform that kind of emotional stability and trust and that they're able to. So basically, what I'm saying is that when they can anchor their identity in contribution and allowing psychological safety rather than control or expertise, I think that's going to give the perception of elasticity. And I think that's going to allow the capacity of evolution in all of the gaps or the age gaps through the departments, if you will, because if there's a leader that emphasizes like task as like as task identity, we might have somebody who's looking for like a what I refer to like purpose identity, and I've used the framework of place of purpose. And so being able to identify that that is a generational shift and who's the audience that I'm talking to about this task, right? So and then looking at values, right? So the role-based validation to maybe more of like a values-based coherence amongst folks, right? So I think through the values clarification and the identity work, I think that's a language that leaders can, I think, not just rebuild stability in how people view them as their leader, but also letting people know that they can have confidence in having a place of purpose. Not just like what they do, but really about around the why and how and who. And so I think there's a lot of conversation there within the inner architectural piece. And then I think there's an avenue to align that through the strategic alignment piece, with that clarity, with that consistency amongst the members,
Mm-hmm.
and having that conversation, because conversations have to be, a two-way communication, where questions aren't punished, right? Or honesty isn't punished. And so when you start to the thermostat, if you will, is that there's going to be some punitiveness or criticalness that follows, then you're not facilitating a team that's going to be that's going to be in line with the value.
So
And if
good.
I
I
may,
want to, yeah, go ahead, Pamela.
I was going to just say, I love everything that Paul was saying, and I wanted to add on to this thought about psychological safety that we put so much pressure on our leaders right now. There's a lot that they have to get done. The leader does not just to have create need to create psychological safety for the team. The team needs to create psychological safety for the leader too.
Mm,
Because if we're going to ask the leader to go back and find out who I am, what my strengths are, so that I can play to those strengths, to understand what I want to do so that we can create organizational and aspirational alignment, to keep an eye on what's happening with the customer and the market and the industry. The work is so complex now, you cannot possibly do that alone. I cannot know everything. So I need to have people that I can depend on. So if the leader goes back and acts differently, we don't want to treat them like I do when my husband shows up flowers for no reason. Like, who are you and what have you done with my husband? Like, why are you showing up that in that way? We actually want to give them the ability to change
mhm.
and to ask questions, to do a bit of appreciative inquiry, to find out who you are, find out how they might be able to best utilize your skills. So give them a chance to be vulnerable to not have to know everything as well.
Love the addition of that. And
Mhm.
really, I, as we've been talking a lot about relevance and identity, it comes to brand equity. At the end of the day, I think both of those can just be kind of wrapped up in your brand equity for your internal team and for your customers and partners and beyond, right? And so that really warrants an audit. Paul, you said, what's the temperature? What's the thermostat? I think that's
Mm.
something we need to audit of how safe does our team feel with us? And do you feel safe with your team? And then, frankly, it might even be an addition and a re-examination of your core identity as an organization. Are there values in place that allow for psychological safety? And then what are the frameworks and processes that are needed in order to accommodate an ongoing iteration thereof after? So really, really important, y'all. It's creating the space, it's going last, some of those kind of practical tactics, but at a core level, do an audit of how is the psychological safety in your environment to then allow, because with everything changing, it is
Mm.
so incredibly important that there's safety to dream, safety to say this needs to be burned up and gone because we can't evolve and grow. Stuff needs to die in order for new life to take form and take shape, but there needs to be safety for death to occur. And courage. So let me go to the next question here. Danilo had a question earlier. He said, when you talk about the non-customer, so this is jumping back to earlier, Pamela, in your framework, what would be the best strategy to attract them, the non-customers, and then in-depth market research or brand awareness? Like, where should we start to really examine how to best serve those non-customers?
Yeah, great question. So there are two types of non-customers, right? The first non-customer might be someone who just refuses to buy from you. Either they feel like they don't want your product, they don't need your product, and you have not done an adequate job of showing them what the job to be done is that you provide that they actually need. It could be that, oh yeah, I need what you're doing for the job to be done, but it just costs too much. And you're charging me way too much for that. I don't need all of that. I just want something at a lower price. But it could be people who don't have access to it. That's another type of non-customer that I don't have access to whatever it is you're providing, either because I can't get to it Or maybe the fact that it's requiring this type of price for me doesn't allow me to get it at all. And so the best thing to offer to a non-customer might be, and you can study Clayton Christensen if you want to really look at that, this idea of giving them a worse product for a lower price. So it doesn't have to be as good as what everyone else is giving. They might say, I don't need all of that. You can actually give them a worse product for a better price. And I believe Anthony Olick does some work around this as well. Those are great people to look up as they talk about jobs to be done. So maybe I don't need all of that. And so if you think about the car industry and if people are playing here in a higher price model space, maybe I can offer you an affordable model because I just need to get from point A to point B. I used to work with a leader that says never buy a Cadillac when a Pinto would do, right? I can get from one place to the next without having to pay you all of that. That's one customer. But the other one might be a customer that's locked out completely. I don't have anything at all that you can offer me. That's the best opportunity because it's easy to beat nothing. Christensen talks about this a lot as well. If I have nothing, if you offer me the most minimal of things, I'll be happy to get it because my option before was nothing. And so you can't look at your premium customers when you're designing tools for the non-customer. You have to think about what would they say that they could do, they could use that may not be as great as your premium product, or what would they take that's the bare minimum. As an example to this, I always love talking about when Google Docs came out. When Google Docs first came out, it was for people who did not have access to other word processing software that was out there. And most of the people who were locked out of those types of tools were people who were college students who are notoriously broke or small businesses who could not have paid for the licenses. They were locked out. They were okay with it not being as good as Microsoft Office was because they felt like my old option was nothing. I didn't have anything that I could use at all. And so the best thing to offer them is something that is going to erase the fact that I can't do anything or something lower than what you might be offering in your prime marketplace. And now over time, you want to ask yourself, could my competitor offer something similar? So if you're going to offer something to a non-customer, just make sure that you do something that solves a job so well that it's difficult for your competition to immediately come back and compete with you. Otherwise, you've just taught your competition how to compete.
Love it. So good. Next question, Paul, this one's for you. We were asked, this is an anonymous question, which I just absolutely love. They said, how much of our external impact depends on being internally aligned with who we are and what we value? In other words, does real value creation start with being aligned with ourselves first?
I think it's dynamic. I mean, it really depends on the person. It's a wonderful question because I think the external environment can most certainly bring about characterological expression that maybe has been dormant,
Mm,
just the same as it can bring about messages, schemas that have also been lying dormant, and it took some sort of trigger in the environment to actually reactivate it. So, that's the thing about working in leadership and executive capacity is just there's a lot of excavating to take place, and that's the part of the position I enjoy, and I find that they enjoy as well because as they're excavating and learning about themselves and their environment, they're taking that information and immediately applying it. And then that application, they come back and they have a new experience that says, "Wow, let me double down on this kind of explorative conversation we've had, and now let me give you this real world experience and how it actually felt, what it sounded, it seemed, how I responded to it." And then it's like a continuous working model. So I think it's both. It's just one is not more than the other. I think that they both contribute.
And if I
good.
could jump in, I was going to say,
Please.
Paul, don't you think a lot of this, depends on your own level of self-awareness, right? Because there are ways I could potentially create value that I don't care about, that I don't like,
Yes.
I don't enjoy. That's
Yeah.
the reason I want to have alignment,
Yeah.
because if not, I find myself doing things that somebody else might appreciate, but I do
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
Mm,
No, working with a recent person in mid-management, unfortunately, when you're in that fight, flight, or fear response and you're stuck in it, nothing works.
mm.
You have to breaking that down to even have any sense of clarity or creativity or having a voice can seem just so daunting. And so meeting the person where they are is also another starting point, and just understanding who they are, where they are, what's happening around them, and just really listening with in depth, to find out, okay, I hear the problem, but what am I actually hearing, right? Like, what
Mm,
am I actually trying to understand when you tell me that uh, the CEO is having a difficult time delegating to the CFO? That's just surface level problem. I don't know what the problem is, and neither do they, but we need to talk more and understand what is it about delegation? What is your relationship with the company? What is your relationship with the CFO? What are your fears? What is micromanaging? Is there perfectionism? And so how can, the system, as you mentioned, Pam, support the leader, and how can the leader support the system? So these are all the different facets of evaluation that take place that really tailor, I think, the experience, because every organization's different, and so is every leader and every person that's a part of that company.
mm, so good. Y'all, this has been such an incredible conversation. I dropped both of your websites here in the chat. Any last remarks? Pamela, we'll start with you, just as we kind of head off. Any question that I did not ask you that I should have asked you?
No, I mean, as Paul said, all of these are so interesting that we could talk about each one of them for an hour, right? It's just one of those things that I think leadership and strategy and identity and relevance, all of those things come together to converge the environment and create that environment of convergence that we see people operating in. And so I would like to leave with this one thought, though, no matter how complex the environment is, no matter how difficult the environment is, I want everyone to understand the spirit of resilience that they have built within them. Everyone has it. You do it naturally, you adapt naturally. But sometimes when we are in environments as leaders, it becomes difficult because of the politics and the personalities that we work with. But I would ask them to, even as they look at all of the things we talked about today, think about the core of themselves and how they show up with their own personal values, their own personal strengths, and say, how do I show up with the best version of myself to attack the problems that I'm having today? Because even if you can't get your organization to be relevant, you can be relevant as an individual.
Yeah.
You can ask questions in your space, in your piece of the planet to help you be relevant. And that will have an impact that's going to help you change or affect the future that you're moving toward.
Brilliant, brilliant. And frankly, back to brand equity, each one of us has a responsibility to invest in our proprietary brands. And there's probably no better thing that you and I can be doing in preparation for the emergence of how things are changing given this revolution.
Yeah.
Paul, any last remarks from you?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the leaders and the executives, and I want to be clear that, the people that I work with, they already have what it takes. And so part of my job there is to help them filter and to identify with more clarity is like, well, what is my inner architecture and how can I maximize that? What is my strategic alignment initiative? How can I maximize that? What is my adaptive leadership style and how can I maximize that? And so I'm not implanting brand new, I'm taking what is already there and these wonderful leaders and executives and folks who want to grow and want to grow the company and grow the people around them and actually just giving it more nutrient and helping them have a finer direction of where does this actually make sense, when's the timing right, et cetera, for them to be the best leaders that they can be.
Love it. Love it. Y'all, we have heard from two of the best. Both of you, thank you so much for your time
That's
and
wonderful.
attention today. It has been so incredibly helpful. Well, with that, I am so grateful for all of you joining today. Y'all, we will be sending the replay out. Feel free if you guys have more questions. We've got both of their websites here in the chat. We'll be sending out the replay across our social platforms as well as via email. So look out for those. We welcome you to share it with others in your organization. Y'all pass along this recording because it's so hard for real change to permeate the entire whole if
Mm.
only a piece of the sum of its part is changing. So pass this along and thank you all so much for joining us. And we hope you have just a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.